Paradise? Lost. Lanny awoke to the sound of someone screaming. It was Megan, and that made Lanny almost start screaming too. Her first thought was to jump to her feet and stop whatever it was from making her friend scream. But instinctively, Lanny knew that would be foolish, despite the enormous rush of panic inside her, so she remained deathly still. She squinted through mostly closed eyelids, remembering the beach was nothing else since then. Remembering the beach, but nothing else since then. Trying to get an idea of where she was and what was happening. Her brain felt too groggy to make sense of everything. Through slitted eyes, she could see Samid on a table next to her, still out cold. She was relieved to see him, and he appeared to be alive. His chest moved up and down. Lanny turned her head to the other side, very slowly, toward the screaming, hoping she wasn't drawing attention to her way. But a second later, something caught her eye, and she stopped moving. Lying in still damp clothes, she broke into a cold sweat and tried to contain a clammy shiver. For a man and a woman in gauzy white shirts stood next to her, their backs to her, blocking her view of her friend's head. They were bent over, focusing very hard on whatever horrible thing they were doing to Megan. Lanny swallowed hard, trying not to freak out and wondering what on earth she could possibly do to save Megan and not make things worse. There was no other sound except for Megan's sobs and cries. It was hard for Lanny to concentrate. She looked over at Samid again, his face so calm and serene, willing him to wake up. She begged and pleaded silently with anyone who might be able to hear the thoughts in her head, and prayed desperately for Samid's eyes to open so that they could plan their imminent escape together. She wasn't sure she could do this alone. Lanny's heart raced. She'd have to startle them, then attack and disable them, and then somehow she and Megan would have to drag Samid out of here. Not impossible, she found herself thinking, and that thought calmed her. Unless, of course, Megan was unable to move. But Lanny couldn't let herself consider that option. Slowly, she slid her hand up her thigh to the opening of her pants pocket. Megan's screams were growing hoarse now, and Lanny turned her inner pleading toward Megan to stay conscious. Keep the white-shirted people occupied and not die. Lanny wriggled her fingers into her wet pants pocket. There was nothing there. She tried the other pocket, but the only thing in there was the pitcher Alex had drawn and given to her. She bit her lip to keep the angry tears back. Someone had taken her spell components. Her heart pounded in her chest so loudly she was sure the people could hear it. She lifted her head slightly to look around the room, knowing she shouldn't be moving so much, but unable to control herself now. She was starting to panic. And there on a table across the room, she saw them. A pile of scatter clips and other assorted components, well out of reach. Lanny let her head rest back on the table and squeezed her eyes shut, telling herself to calm down, to just stay cool and think. But Megan's cries were totally unnerving her. Lanny wasn't sure how much longer she could stand it. She needed a plan now. An instant later, Megan's screams stopped. Only the echo of them hung in the air for a second before fading. Lanny tensed her stomach, clenching and churning. Had they killed her friend? With no more time to think, Lanny pulled her knees up to her chin and kicked out at the man, striking him in the center of his back and knocking him off balance into the floor. She leaped off the table and lunged for the components, managing only to knock them to the ground as the man grabbed her by the ankle and pulled her down. Megan, silent, struggled to her elbow. She kicked out weakly at the woman who had been holding her down on the table. Lanny's eyes widened. Megan was alive. Lanny grabbed a handful of scatter clips and sent them soaring through the air at the woman who was now wrestling with Megan. The scatter clips caught the woman's clothing and dragged her several feet away from Megan to the wall, pinning her there. A look of shock and frustration crossed over her face as she struggled and failed to release herself from their grasp. And then the man was getting up and grabbing for Lanny's ankles, trying to keep them from rising to her feet. "Run, Megan! Get help!" she screamed, reaching blindly for the components. "I'm coming!" Megan, dazed and no doubt in shock, staggered to the door obediently as Lanny clawed at the dirt floor, trying to reach another scatter clip. "Go!" she yelled again, and Megan, without looking back, disappeared from view. The man yanked Lanny by the ankles as Lanny tried desperately to twist over hers to her stomach so she could see where the components were. "Sam, wake up!" Lanny screamed. "Sam!" She wriggled one leg free from the man's grasp, kicked him hard in the jaw, sending him reeling once again. He hit his head on the corner of a table and fell to the ground, conscious but dazed on top of the components. Lanny jumped to her feet and made a quick assessment. She looked at the door, which stood open now. Megan was gone. She looked at Samid, who hadn't moved. The woman was still stuck fast to the wall. She was sure of it. The man was starting to struggle to his feet. There was no way Lanny could risk going anywhere near him to grab another scatterclip. She scrambled to Samid's side and slapped his face, tugging at his arm and screaming his name. "Sam! Wake up!" she sobbed. "Please!" She looked at the man who was standing now, grabbing a rope from a drawer and coming towards her, and then she looked at Samid, lying helpless. Nothing barred her way to the door. She could still run. But she couldn't leave him there. She shoved her hands into her pockets once more in a desperate move to see if perhaps the strange captors had accidentally missed one scatterclip or a bit of rubber in the fold of her pockets. But it was not to be. For the second time since they'd been captured, her fingers touched the picture Alex had drawn. But this time she drew in a sharp breath, and her eyes opened wide with the realization that there might indeed be one last hope. She gripped the drawing, her lips moving slightly as she mouthed the necessary word. Seek. With a fire-like blast, a ball of light burst from her pocket, not harming her in the least. It zigzagged to the doorway and disappeared. A second later, dozens more silent people appeared, as if now from nowhere, and flooded into the room, trapping Lanny between the wall and the head of Samid's table. She stood bravely facing them, gripping and pulling hard on Samid's hair, hoping the pain would wake him, but it didn't. "Go, Megan," she pleaded silently. "Come on, Alex." The man she fought now weaved his way through the crowd, most of whom were using a strange sort of sign language to communicate. Some stood on tiptoes, trying to see what was happening. All of them wore scarves around their necks, with symbols printed on them. Lanny shrank back as the man with the rope approached. He signaled to another man, who roughly grabbed Lanny by the shoulders and turned her around to face the wall. Her cheek pressed up against the clammy coolness of it. The man took her wrists, pinning them at her sides. "Samid!" she yelled once more, kicking backwards and startling everyone, but not enough to allow her to escape. The man with the rope pulled it around Lanny's neck and held it tight. Lanny struggled, but it was no use. First she saw spots dance before her eyes as she struggled to breathe, and then a wall of blackness. She could hang on to consciousness no longer. She slumped forward against the wall. When Lanny woke again, the screams she heard this time were her own. Her body was now tied to the same table she'd been on before. A different woman with strange golden orange a different woman with strange golden orange eyes held Lanny's head still, while another painstakingly threaded metal thorns through the skin of her neck.